Hello everyone, this is Jordan's channel and I'm Jordan like the river. So this is video 2 of my supplementary Christian reading series where we're going through the Book of Concord. Okay, so I guess first I should mention we're starting the Ausburg Confessions, but I'm going to read the editor's note, so I want to tell you who the editors of the book are. I bought the book that was edited by Kolb and Timothy J. Wengert. It's translated by Charles Arund, Eric Grissesh, Robert Kolb, William Russell, James Cath, Jane Strahl, and Timothy J. Wengert. So it's from Fortress Press, Minneapolis. I'm not trying to do any copyright infringements. I am just trying to share Christian history and the Christian faith. So I wanted to give credit where credit is due. So I thought, oh, maybe I could sum up what happened. But honestly, why do it when someone smarter than me can do it? So I'm just going to read you the introduction of the Augsburg Confession, and then we will start on the preface next video. Okay, so this is the Augsburg Confession. Editor's introduction to the Augsburg Confession. In 1521, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V outlawed Martin Luther and his teaching at the Imperial Diet of Worms and ordered the suppression of all attempts to reform the church in his lands according to Luther's program for reformation. So now you're seeing here the fight between the Catholic Church and the Lutherans. Throughout the 1520s, princes and cities intent on introducing that program jockeyed for political position with imperial and Roman Catholic forces within the assemblies, which is also diets, of the empire. At Nuremberg in 1522 and 1523, and Speyer at 1526 and 1529. As a result of the ambiguous edict of the 1526 Diet of Speyer, where German princes promised to carry out the Edict of Worms according to their own consciences, Elector John of Saxony undertook a formal visitation of the parishes in his territory without permission from the local Roman Catholic bishops. So you're starting to see a revolt against the Catholic Church, who at this time was doing many terrible things and had many pagan practices and had stepped away from the Bible and was under reform. And as we know from history class, that this is when Luther stepped up to make his reform, and it's when Calvin did his movement. And as much as you think this is ancient history, it really does shape our Christian world today. That's why this is very important. We'll go into that a little later, but that's why I'm reading this to you. Okay. In this connection, Philip Melanchthon, oh my gosh, I couldn't say that, aided by Martin Luther and John Bunchangen, Wittenberg's head pastor, published in 1528 doctrinal guidelines for Saxony's pastors, entitled Instructions by the Visitors. At the Diet of Speyer in 1529, Charles had corrected the ambiguity of the earlier edict directed against the spread of the Lutheran reform. This elicited a formal appeal or prostatio, testimony or confessions, of Luther's princely supporters. So people had to start picking a side. You had to pick whether you were going to support Luther's churches, who are at this time still Catholic, or you're going to support the Mother Catholic Church. So that's really when the split was happening. They wanted to kick the Catholic churches that were following Luther's path out of Catholicism because they refused to reform. And we're seeing that now, and that's why you even had the Ausburg Confession. Charles wanted to marshal support for his war against the Turkish imperial forces, which had laid siege to Vienna in 1529. He was in conflict with France, and he wanted to consolidate his own power within Germany at the expense of the relatively independent territorial princes. So these princes were independent. They got to pick what side they wanted. The emperor also was concerned about the life of the church and interested in promoting a moral and institutional reform, Like I said, they first wanted to reform the church, which clearly, as we know, historically, they did not reform the church, and the Catholic Church really wasn't reformed until Vatican II in the 1960s, and even then, it has a lot of work to be done. At the same time, he despised the doctrinal reformation Luther had set in motion. Therefore, after negotiations with Pope Clement, I think that's the 7th, in Bologna in January 1530, he called for the Lutheran princes and cities to explain their religious program before an imperial diet, which he called for late spring in the city of Ausburg. So now they're all coming together to discuss what they're going to do about these reforms. Are they going to reform the church like Luther did? Or are they going to do it in a different way, and they're going to reform the Catholic Church? Now, there was, in backlash to the Protestant Reformation, a Bible that was reprinted in the 1600s called the Douay Rheims Bible to try and promote Catholicism when there was such a great division. But after all, as we know, Vatican I really didn't change all that much, like I just said before. Okay. In preparation for this diet, Elector John of Saxony commissioned his theologians, led by Luther and Melanchthon, I can't say these names, I'm sorry, to prepare working papers on the issues that had led to the reform in the Saxon and other territorial churches influenced by Luther's teaching. The so-called Thurgau articles, named after the Saxon town, where some work on them was completed, developed in a series of drafts and treated the subjects of human ordinances, marriage of priests, both kinds, bread and wine and the Lord's Supper, the sacrifice of the Mass, confession, ecclesiastical jurisdiction, ordination, monastic vows, invocation of saints, and the use of the vernacular in worship. So pretty much almost every aspect of church was being reformed. If you think about all those areas, we have marriage with priests, huge issue. I mean, you still kind of see that debate today, and if you're involved in the Catholic Church, because they have a lack of priests, and now they're wondering, should they get married? Well, I'm pretty sure every single other denomination, their priests or pastors marry. So you also see the Mass and the Lord's Supper. You went from transubstantiation to consubstantiation, which is a huge jump. Now we have a couple other beliefs. I believe those are both considered heretical in some Christian circles, but I'm not quite sure who follows what. Still looking into that. I'll get back to you. But yes, you had ideas about the Lord's Supper that was being changed. Type of worship. I mean, if you go into a Lutheran church and you go into a Catholic church, it's the same thing but different wording. But the theology is vastly different, even if the worship is the same. And that's really what matters at the end of the day, I think, is the theology. But as far as I'm aware, contemporary Christians don't really know their history all that well. So I think you can easily get sucked into the religiosity of the worship if you don't know your history. That's why it's important to read this kind of stuff. I'm not Lutheran, but I'm just going through the book and going through the history and learning about it and learning about all the different types of Christianity. I believe in the kingdom mentality. I serve Christ, my King. So if you're Christian, you're Christian. That's just how I view it. But that doesn't mean I'll never have been to a Lutheran church. But I've also been to a Catholic church. I've also been to non-denominational churches. Been to a lot of different churches. But I'm planted... I don't know. I'll get more into that later. Okay. Where was I though? The so-called Thurgau articles, named after the Saxon town, where some work on them was completed, developed in a series of drafts and treated subject... Okay, we did that. Because he had declared an outlaw by the emperor in 1521, Luther dared not travel to Ausburg, where he would certainly have been arrested. So at this point, they're out to get Luther. Which I think Luther, I really like Luther because he stood up against an injustice and he really fought tooth and nail to reform, which needed to be done. perhaps executed by Charles' forces. Instead, Macaltheon, head of the Saxon theologians who went to the Diet, in Ausburg, he was greeted by a new publication edited by John Eck, professor of Ingolstadt. I work on my German, sorry. Ingolstadt. One of the brightest and best of Roman Catholic theologians in Germany at the time, and a sworn enemy of the Wittenbergers. This assembly of 404 proportions presented citations from Luther, Macaltheon, and their colleagues, mixed with a wide range of statements from others who were criticizing the church, including Antiquarians and Anabaptists, as well as Ulrich and Zwingli, and others who shared his rejection of the real presence of Christ's body and blood in the Lord's Supper, transubstantiation. So they're rejecting transubstantiation. That's one of the major reforms. That's one of the major differences between Roman Catholics and Lutherans. By grouping them together with the Wittenberg theologians, Eck gave the impression that the Saxon theology affirmed most heresies known to the church. Macaltheon realized that the Lutherans would have to do more than address the issues of reform. They would have to demonstrate their own orthodoxy and Catholicity. So they had to kind of prove to the Christians of the day, since the only Christians were, you had the Eastern Orthodox on the other side of the world, or you had the Roman Catholics in the West. There were no other Christians. So they had to prove that they were Orthodox Christians and not heretical groups, because at the time there were a lot of different heretical groups rising up. I mean, you even see that today. There are a lot of different type of Christian cults that teach very strange things about the Bible that aren't necessarily Christian. Nothing's new under the sun, Ecclesiastes. Therefore, he constructed a confession, changing its name from Apologia, which is a defense, of 21 articles on doctrinal topics and 7 articles on reform efforts. In so doing, he sought to show that the theology taught in Wittenberg remained true to the Catholic tradition, both by stating the biblical truth and by condemning false teachings also rejected by Roman Catholic opponents. He drew the doctrinal positions for this confession from articles prepared from a League of Lutheran governments in the summer of 1529. The Schwabach articles, expanding them, especially in, I don't know what that says, to meet Eck's most serious changes. To complete formulating the doctrinal articles of the confession, he appropriated material from the Marburg articles, composed as a result of the colloquy between the Wittenberg and the Ulrich, Zwingli, and Zurich, along with his Swiss colleagues in October 1529. Luther's own summary of his faith in the 3rd section of his confession concerning Christ's Supper and the instruction of the visitors. To the doctrinal articles composed on the basis of these documents, he added a revised version of the earlier Saxon drafts concerning abuses that needed reform. So their goal originally was to try and reform what needed to be reformed within the church, while proving that they're still members of the church because they follow certain orthodoxies of the church that all Christians believe, and they stayed away from heretical teachings. They were trying to convince their opponents to join their side. And as we know, history told us, they did not succeed, and there ended up being a separate church, which then spread into more churches, and that's even how we have contemporary Christianity and all the very churches of the day. After several weeks of intensive negotiation, in Ausburg, Zwingli himself sent his own Ratio Fidelis, ground of faith, to the emperor and the 4 cities, Strasbourg, Meiningen, Lindau, and Constance, under the leadership of Martin Bauer, presented the Confessio Tetrapolitana. After several weeks of intensive negotiation with representatives of the Roman Catholic princes and bishops, as well as the emperor, 7 Lutheran princes and 2 municipal governments subscribed Malkan's confessions and presented it to the emperor and the assembled princes and the representatives of imperial cities in the Diet of 25th June of 1530. Chancellor Christian Bayer of Elector John's government read the German text to the Diet, and his voice carried its words into the streets outside. In according with the imperial instructions, Malcolm had also prepared a Latin version of the confession that was handed over to Charles at the same time. So if you got caught on that, this is one of the first times that the Bible and texts were written in native tongues. So they wrote it in German. At the time, which is also the language of the Catholic Church, everything else was written in Latin, which was kind of like the fancy business language of the time. So most people did not know Latin unless you were royalty. So they wanted it to be accessible to the common man and to the imperials in a way that the royalty felt respected, so they had the Latin, and the way that other people who were not royalty could also partake, which I thought is very clever. So they have a German version and a Latin version, and we're going to read the translation into English from both of those. And that's just for the Ausburg Confession as far as I'm aware. So we're almost done. Please bear with me. Further negotiations followed. At the time, Roman Catholic theologians commissioned by the emperor formulated a confutation of this confession. By accepting this government, the emperor rejected the Lutheran claim to legitimacy. And at the end of the diet, he commanded the Lutheran governments to return to the Roman obedience by April 1531, or face suppression. So now he's saying, oh, you have to be Catholic. But we know how that went. The text of the Ausburg Confessions was published by 1531. Because of its acceptance as a kind of mission statement for the evangelical churches, Malcolm felt an obligation to continue to improve it. Variations in the German text appeared in the second edition, 1533, and the Latin text was altered at certain points in the third, that's 1540, and the fourth, 1542 editions. These changes became controversial in the 1560s when the 10th article of this Confession Augustan Variata was used by Elector Frederick III of the Palatinate to justify the spiritualizing doctrine of the Lord's Supper that his theologians were propagating under Genevan influence. That sounded like alien to me, so we won't go into it. Thus, those who opposed the position insisted on the Confessio Augustana in Veratia, the original text of the 1531 Editio Princeps. Okay, so they just decided to go with the original rather than the edited versions. I think that was actually just an interesting piece of history, but not really relevant to what we're going to talk about. So yes, that is the history said by people better than myself. I thought it was hilarious when I said to bear with me, and my mother said, I'll try. She's in the other room cooking dinner. So I'm sure you feel the same way. Please accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior today, and I will not bore you any longer. Goodbye.